So today I'm going to be talking about the American Bitcoin advantage, why we are the Bitcoin superpower of the world, and what that means for this country and the role that Bitcoin can play in this country. A little bit about myself for some background. I've been a research analyst at River for a little bit over a year. I've been in the industry for a little bit over 4 years. I'm definitely a Bitcoiner. These are some of the reports I've put out over the past year. And as I said, I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, same birthplace as Michael Saylor, so I'm very proud of that. And I'm very impressed with the turnout in Columbus. I go to a lot of the Bitcoin meetups in the Denver, Boulder area, and this definitely beats the turnout there. So, we put out a report on the American Bitcoin advantage a couple of weeks ago, just prior to the Bitcoin conference. We wanted to educate American individuals, the business sector, and policymakers on the impact that Bitcoin can have on this country. And we wanted to make a bold claim that would actually catch the eye of politicians and people that can, move Bitcoin forward in this country. And so we put out a tweet with our report release, making the claim that America is the Bitcoin superpower. And over the next week, we started to hear a little bit more chatter about this topic. We had Trump make a few truths, I guess, if you call them that, on America being the Bitcoin superpower of the world. JD Vance also gave a speech at the Bitcoin conference, citing a few of the stats from the report. So we're happy that this made somewhat of an impact, driving this technology forward. But I actually want to get into what this actually means. It's kind of a bold claim, and what metrics are we actually making to show that America is the Bitcoin superpower. Can you guys see the screen okay? Am I blocking it? You can see it fine? Okay. The first question we really dove into when we started the research for this is, how much Bitcoin do Americans hold? It's a stat that I'd never seen before. A lot of people had guesses, but it's very difficult to find, given that you can't trace the Bitcoin supply to an actual jurisdiction because of the way that wallets are pseudonymous. So we ended up pulling data from a lot of different resources, data providers, and segmenting the Bitcoin supply by year to trace how much Bitcoin activity is can be attributed to the United States in each year. I'm happy to get into the methodology in the Q&A or afterwards if you're interested. But the conclusion that we came to is that Americans are in control or own roughly 40% of the Bitcoin supply, which is actually a tremendous amount. It's between 13 and 14 million Bitcoin. And that has led to over $800 billion of wealth creation in the United States. So by doing nothing other than just holding Bitcoin, that alone has provided a lot of value for this country. And we all know that America is a superpower in many regards. So how does the stat actually stack up against our economic might or the natural resources that we have? So I just want to show you guys this graphic that kind of hits it home that we have a greater advantage in Bitcoin than our advantages in many other commonly shared metrics, from total wealth to the size of our economy, the amount of gold holdings that we have. And I hope this is something that politicians and thought leaders in the United States pay attention to and maybe think hard about. So when you actually dive into the ownership that we do have, it turns out that it's very broad-based. We're pulling this data from a survey that the Nakamoto Project did last year, showing that the United States outpaces every other major developed country in terms of Bitcoin ownership. There's some countries like El Salvador and the UAE that have a higher percentage-based ownership, but those countries are quite small, and we outpace every other large economy in this metric. And so in absolute numbers, that equates to roughly 50 million Americans that own Bitcoin in some form or fashion. And to put that in context, that's more people that are invested in Bitcoin than gold. And so I think that's a powerful signal for how the reserve asset of the United States is starting to shift. So diving into ownership a little bit more, if you look at Bitcoin ownership by public companies, we dominate the market share globally. Adding up the treasury holdings of MicroStrategy, who you may have heard of, or publicly traded Bitcoin miners within the United States, or Tesla, we have about a 95% market share of Bitcoin holdings among public companies. And I think that's due to the deep liquidity of our capital markets, and also just the regulatory clarity that we have in the United States for public companies to use Bitcoin as a treasury asset. Looking at some of the other publicly traded vehicles like Bitcoin ETFs, Americans own roughly 80% of all Bitcoin ETFs worldwide. And it's not just individuals that are holding a Bitcoin ETF through their Roth IRA or on their Fidelity brokerage account. It's also some of the largest institutions in the US, RIAs, pension funds, endowments, insurance companies. And so this is going very mainstream within Wall Street. Adding up the actual institutional investment among US firms in Bitcoin ETFs, it's over $30 billion. And this is led by some of the larger funds in the United States. If you look at the top 25 US hedge funds and registered investment advisors, the majority of them already have exposure to Bitcoin ETFs. Going on to government Bitcoin holdings. We don't know the exact numbers that the U.S. government has or that other governments have, but we're relying a little bit on a mix of what's publicly reported and then what has been tracked by wallets online. But we can estimate that the United States has roughly 200,000 Bitcoin, and this turns out to be a lot because that means that the U.S. has roughly 2/3 of all government Bitcoin reserves. Of course, Trump established the strategic Bitcoin reserve in March, and hopefully we continue that lead. But to put this into context of some other strategic assets that we have, I wanted to compare the United States to China, our largest rival, at least economically. Right now, if you compare our gold holdings on a percentage basis, the United States holds between 3 and 4 times as much gold as China. And that might seem like a large margin, but it's actually been declining since the 1970s when we went off the gold standard. On the other hand, we have a tremendous advantage over some of our largest rivals in terms of Bitcoin holdings. And this is another thing that I would encourage our politicians to pay some attention to. So I've gone over ownership a lot, but I want to go into Bitcoin's impact on the economy a little bit, how it's driving investment in the United States. We counted up all the Bitcoin-focused companies within the US, and we have this pretty map here with River. River also is proudly only operational in the United States. And the point that I want to make in the next few slides is just the fact that the US is the best place to set up operations as a Bitcoin-focused company. How do we actually know this? Well, the Bitcoin industry employs over 20,000 Americans. If you look at all venture investment worldwide that goes into Bitcoin-focused companies, over 70% of that goes to companies based in the US. Another thing I want to highlight as Bitcoin relates to the private sector is that Bitcoin adoption extends much further beyond the Bitcoin industry itself. We're actually seeing very widespread adoption among businesses that are starting to hold it as a treasury asset far beyond the Bitcoin industry. You may have heard of strategy and large public companies buying billions of dollars, but at River we actually serve over 2,000 business clients, many of which are small and medium-sized businesses. And yeah, I wanted to show this chart just because I think it's a very compelling way to show how widespread this adoption is. It's practically in every industry of our economy, and it just goes to show like, the value that Bitcoin can have in improving the financial quality and soundness of businesses in the private sector. Another question we had is, okay, how much dollars are actually being invested in the United States from the Bitcoin industry? And this was a little bit harder to estimate, but we realized that most of the investment is actually not coming from service-based companies like River. It's actually from the mining industry. So here I've mapped out the over 40 mining sites in the US that are currently operational with over 10 megawatts. The mining industry is very capital intensive. It's very similar to a data center business. You have to employ a lot of people. You have to invest heavily in energy infrastructure. There are high upfront costs and ongoing costs. And so from that, based on the power demand of the mining industry, we estimate that Bitcoin mining alone has driven over $30 billion of investment in the US since 2021. We've also generated revenues of over $40 billion in that time period. And why do I pick 2021 as a benchmark? Well, before that year, most of the Bitcoin mining industry was located in China, and that was due to their very cheap cost of power. They have a lot of hydroelectricity, and it was somewhat of the Wild West before 2021. But in the spring of that year, the Chinese government instituted a ban on Bitcoin mining. And I think that was a wake-up call for a lot of companies in the industry that realized, hey, we actually need to care about the jurisdiction that we operate in. And it really matters to set up operations in a country that is supportive of the industry, that has regulatory clarity, and the United States is just that. And so for that reason, the United States recently took the top spot as the leading country in terms of Bitcoin mining. This is a map of hash rate distributed across the world, and we have more than twice the hash rate as the runner-up. A couple other quick hits from the report. We lead in funding Bitcoin development. I certainly hope that continues in the future. More than 80% of developer funding comes from US-based organizations, and we're also home to a very large cohort of open source developers for Bitcoin. Lastly, we now have a Congress and an administration that are very much pro-Bitcoin, and this is as of the last election cycle. I expect that in the future, for decades to come, hopefully, this will continue to be the case, because at the end of the day, Bitcoin is not a partisan technology, the same way that the internet wasn't, and it's something that I think people across the aisle can come together on and support. There are a few other metrics on American Bitcoin dominance that you can find in our report online, but I wanted to leave it on that and go into what Bitcoin's role for America actually is. And this is really the core reason why we wrote the report, to educate politicians and thought leaders on what value can Bitcoin actually bring. Well, a lot of the success of America, I think, has been driven by a certain eagerness to adopt new technologies, whether that's been the internet or going way back to the automobile or technologies in the Industrial Revolution. And it's really exactly the same with Bitcoin. We've been the first to adopt it. We have a very large lead, and the onus is on us, on Americans, to continue that lead into the future. And what value will that provide us? Well, for individuals, Bitcoin is very much about just taking financial ownership of your life. With Bitcoin, you can, it allows you to plan long into the future in an environment where inflation and monetary debasement is making it very hard for people to build up a savings, to put their kids through college, and to have any sort of predictability about what their finances will look like in 10 years. It's very much the case for businesses as well that Bitcoin can help everyday businesses withstand long periods of economic uncertainty. Of course, uncertainty is like the worst thing that a business can face. And so I think that's why we're seeing such tremendous adoption with businesses putting Bitcoin on their treasury. And for the federal government, I know a lot of us talk about how Bitcoin may how politicians may be like against Bitcoin because they have like clashing interests. I actually think that Bitcoin will be very beneficial for the federal government in multiple regards. For one, I guess in the short term, we have a government that has over $36 trillion in debt. There's really no pathway forward that anyone has proposed to deleverage our balance sheet without taking extreme austerity measures or hiking up everyone's taxes. I think there was a lot of chatter about this in the previous months with Doge, but we just passed another bill that will raise our deficit by however many $1 trillion. I think Bitcoin has a role to play here. And Cynthia Lummis has talked a lot about this. We have the Bitcoin Act that hopefully will get approved at some point in the coming future. And Bitcoin at the end of the day can help deleverage our balance sheet. In the long term, I think it will play a more important role for the government in that it actually provides a check on government overreach, whether that is from a privacy perspective or from simply preventing the government from overspending and getting us back into the situation we are now. So yeah, I hope a lot of people begin to appreciate more and more how much Bitcoin can benefit this country. And I had a lot of fun writing the report because it made me not only more bullish on Bitcoin, but more optimistic about this country. So that was my presentation. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions.